Добро пожаловать всех наших участников этого вебинара. Мы немного экспериментируем теперь с новым форматом, потому у нас могут быть какие-то еще технические моменты, как сейчас, например, с лайвстримом на Фейсбуке. Я бы попросил всех, которые хотят украинский перевод слышать, переставить на японский флаг, который они внизу видят. Напишите, пожалуйста, в чате, или у вас это получается с японским флагом, или нет. Это с середины, вы можете две кнопки направо перейти и там переставить на японский флаг, и тогда вы будете слышать во время презентации украинский перевод, который будет симультанно проходить. Напишите, пожалуйста, в чат, если у вас это получается или нет. Да. Окей, получилось. Все вышло. Хорошо. Тогда я перехожу на английскую мову. For Kristijoonas, I'm switching to English. We just figured out the translation and the interpretation function. So, hello, Kristijoonas. I would like to introduce you to our audience today. So, this is Kristijonas Medelis. He's 22 years old and from the second biggest Lithuanian city, Kaunas. He studied history at Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands and published on historical and security issues in Central and Eastern Europe. Currently, he works as an analyst for the business consulting company Vikistrat. We have another person entering our webinar room. I would wait for her. Okay. Катерина, just информация для тебя. Тебе надо переставить на японский флаг, чтобы услышать перевод Артура.
На японский?
На японский флаг, да.
Так, а как это сделать?
Это надо зайти на главную.
Все, я поняла.
И ты там увидишь услышишь Артура голос. Получается?
Артура не слышу, но на японский я переставила.
Хорошо, да.
Все, я чую.
Sorry for the quick interruption. Okay, so I continue then with the presentation. So, Kristijonas works currently as an analyst for the business consulting company Vikistrat. Our presentation today happens on that difficult date when 75 years ago the Allied forces forced the murderous German Nazi regime to capitulation. This stopped the war in Europe, the genocide of Jews, of whom 6 million were murdered by the Nazis and their allies and their collaborators all over Europe. And it stopped the genocide and mass murder of other minorities and groups such as the Roma population. But for quite a few countries, the tragedy was not over with the capitulation of Nazi Germany. Countries like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia and Ukraine, on whose territory the murderous Nazi regime raged most during the Second World War, they were violently incorporated into the Soviet Union. And this is where I would like to pass the word to our speaker today, to Kristijonas. And in the end, you will have also the opportunity to ask questions and to write them in a chat function here, or if our live stream will start functioning on Facebook and also there. But in general, approach us through the chat function here. Kristijonas, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. As Igor said, my name is Kristijonas, and I'm here to talk about the Victory Day in Lithuania, and to give you to explain how we view this day over here. And for those who are not going to stay here for the whole presentation, I will just quickly go over the historical reasons and the political reasons as to why we do not celebrate this day. So, as Igor briefly covered, there are two main historical reasons why we do not celebrate this day. So basically, in most modern history, the biggest tragedy of 20th century begun in 1939 and ended in 1945. However, in Lithuania, this was not the case. After the annexation of Lithuania, after the official annexation of Lithuania by the Soviet Union in 1945, Lithuania was in fact only in the middle of its biggest tragedy. Now, why was it a tragedy? Well, first of all, that's when the Soviet deportation started, and that's when the Lithuanians' resistance and partisans went out to the forest to fight the Soviet regime. And well, I left this slide quite empty intentionally because we simply do not celebrate that day. And however, there are some, the Russian minorities are free to celebrate this day, and I think most of Lithuanians understand the reasons why they celebrate this day as a victory against Nazism. The other more, I would say, recent and political reasons not to celebrate Victory Day are, there are quite a few of them, but I will give a specific example of it. In 2015, the Lithuania's president, Dalia Grybauskaitė, otherwise known as the Iron Lady, commented on the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow and said that no Lithuanian should be made to stand in a military parade in Moscow underneath flags of occupied Crimea. So Lithuanians showed, they used this day as a kind of to show support for Ukrainians, and we still continue to, show the support up until this day. And it's an issue which I think never left Lithuanians' minds, and the issues in Ukraine still come up in Lithuania to this day, and there's quite a few politicians who are very interested in helping Ukraine in any way possible. So basically, since independence in the 1990s, not a single Lithuanian president has attended the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. It is simply not going to happen in near future if things not change, and the things will continue as they are right now. So if you are interested in hearing more about the two historical developments that I mentioned before, the Soviet deportations and the resistance fighters, I'm going to cover them right now more deeply. So first of all, we have the Soviet deportations. They started in 1941 and ended in 1952. At least during this period, at least 130,000 people were deported. 70% of them were women and children. It might not seem a lot, if for example, for Ukrainians, because I mean, it is a lot, but it might not seem that much to you because you're a big country with a lot of people. But for Lithuania, which had barely 3 million people at that time, it meant that more than 5% of their people got deported to Siberia. Approximately 28,000 of Lithuanian deportees died in exile due to poor living conditions. I will expand on these, really, really horrible living conditions a bit later. Only half of the people returned. Out of the 130,000 people deported, only half of them returned because, as I said, 30,000 people died, and 30,000 people were prohibited from settling back in their homeland. And finally, the last deportees were released only in 1963. Here we have, so basically, I'm going to tell you about the 4 major deportations that happened and just give you some more details about them. First of all, the first deportations in 1941. So in the picture, you see the trains and the cars that were used to, get the deportees to Siberia, and they were like unloaded like cattle to these trucks. It was the conditions in these trains were horrible, and the basically the first deportations were the worst ones because a lot of people died. In the end, it was counted that about 16,000 people were deported during these deportations. In exile, the families of Lithuanians were always, well, very often separated, meaning that children and women went to one camps and men went to different ones. And there are many, you can read many letters of women writing to the Soviet government and asking to at least be settled with their families. But of course, that did not happen. Then you have the first post-war deportations. That's when the Soviets came back in 1944. During this, well, officially, the people who were going to be deported were labeled as bandits, nationalists, socially dangerous, enemies of the people. However, in reality, what happened is that these people were almost selected randomly. Those people that deported people included poor farmers, rich tradesmen, teachers, priests, doctors, officials, office workers, politically active people. So, in my mind, I could justify, well, not really justify, but I could be more okay with if the Soviet regime only targeted, people who actively resisted Soviet government and annexation. But in fact, what happened is that the Soviet deportations were aimed at dismantling Lithuanian families, and they were, in my eyes, truly cruel. During these deportations, 6,000 people were deported. So we move on to Operations Vesna and Priboi. These are basically the two biggest deportations in Lithuanian history. Operation Vesna happened on 5 days in May 22 to 27th in 1948. According to official documents, 40,000 people were deported and around 11,000 families. As for Operation Priboi, it happened a year later and 30,000 people got deported. If you look at the numbers, I have them in the slide. In the case of Operation Priboi, out of the 30,000 people that were deported, there were only 9,000 men. So you can see that there were as many children and even more women deported than men. Like, how do you justify the deportation of 8,000 children who were sometimes newborns, sometimes they were 1 or 2 years old? In my mind, in a lot of Lithuanians' minds, I think, this truly depicts the evil nature of the Soviet regime. Now we come to the last deportations, which was Operation Osen. The difference between the last deportations and this one is that this deportation was aimed at specifically Lithuanians, while the last deportations also included Latvians, Estonians. This is because Lithuanians were still actively resisting collectivization, farm collectivization. There were still active resistance, armed resistance movements. During this operation, around 20,000 people were deported. The newcomers, the deportees, were settled in the remotest and least developed territories of the Soviet Union and given jobs in wood processing, chemical plants, mines, or collective and state farms. Irrespective of their educational or professional background, all deportees had to perform hard physical labor. They were referred to as special settlers, meaning that they could not leave the area of residence they were assigned to. So, well, they were prisoners. You could call them that. The last topic, I think this part of the presentation truly, shows how it truly depicts how evil and meaningless the deportations were, how they were, aimed at taking the Lithuanian nation apart. Well, in my eyes, you can see here on the left, these are all pictures of kids, literal kids. Some of them you can see they're like 3, 4, 5 years old, and they're all deportees. When the Soviet government had to, in some way justify the deportations of these kids, and the way they did that is they called these kids enemies of the socialist state. How can one even call a 2-year-old enemy of the socialist state is beyond me. But so to give you an example how young these kids were when they were deported, well, if we look at the first operation I talked about, the first post-war deportations, out of 16,000 people, there were about 5,500 people, 5,500 children. 1,000 of these children were less than 4 years old, 2,000 were between ages 5 and 10, and 2,200 were between ages of 11 and 18. So I will read some stories of these kids. Some of them actually managed to come back to Lithuania and share their stories in their memoirs. So although according to the instruction, the deportees' families were given no longer than 2 hours to prepare for the deportation, and they could bring 100 kilograms of food, clothing, personal belongings. However, in reality, that did not happen. They were often deported as they were found without any proper clothing and resources. One of the Lithuanian child deportees, Jūratė Marcinkevičienė, arrested at the age of 4, describes one of these typical cases. So I'm going to read a quote now by her. Our entire family was deported in the early morning of June 13th, 1941. 7 soldiers came, forced us from our sleep. They seated father on a stool, ordered him to raise his hands, and pointed a pistol at him. They seated us, 4 children, at the table. We were crying and screaming, afraid for father. After they finished the search, they piled all our books in the yard and set them on fire, telling us that they were bourgeoisie literature. My youngest sister was only 2 years old. So, yeah, and this is not that the stories don't end. They go on and on. And to give you another example, in Kaunas, which is the second biggest city in Lithuania, during the arrest of an 8-year-old Jokūbas Baronas, he was shot through his shoulder. Shooting was quite common practice among the security forces to intimidate the victims. 13-year-old Antanina Garmute was seized separately from her family because her parents were not home at the time of the arrest. She was ordered to gather her belongings in 5 minutes. After an attempted escape, she was beaten unconscious. So, these stories are quite tragic. I mean, who in the right mind would shoot the 8-year-old? I know that this wasn't planned by the Soviet government, but it even shows further that the people who carried out these deportations were, I would say even more evil, even more immoral than the system itself. And as I said before, women and children and the elderly were deported separately from the family heads. And there's another, to give you an example cruel the living conditions were, even in the transportation in the trains to Siberia, I'll quote Andriukaitis. So this is a quote I'm going to read. Žeglienė was lifted from the train and laid on the ground, but she lost blood and died, and the baby was screaming next to her. We don't know whether anyone took him because our train moved ahead after letting a military echelon pass by. The dead mother and her newborn remained on the ground. I think these stories are, they depict, they show what I meant with, the tragedy of Lithuanian history. So the other topic I have is the resistance fighters. The Lithuanian resistance fighters were quite a big organization. They managed to get 30,000 people at one point. And to show you again why we do not celebrate the Victory Day is basically a few days after the World War II finished, after the Victory Day, one of the bloodiest battles of the Lithuanian armed resistance, the Battle of Kalniškės, was fought. So, and to give you an idea, who joined these forest brothers and the partisans, and who fought against the Soviet regime, well, it included quite a lot of people from diverse backgrounds. It was Lithuanian farmers, school teachers, professors, high school students, some people from the army that was still left after the occupation. And the thing is, I actually found out about it recently myself, is the Lithuanian armed resistance wasn't just about, killing Soviets or anything like that. Well, it was an important part of it, but it was also about persevering actual independence. So, for example, in some regions where the movement was quite big, in 1945, they were actually semi-independent from the Soviet government. Soviet troops were actually afraid to, enter these small towns and small regions where the resistance was really, active. For example, and the thing is, these resistance fighters, they actually set up semi-government institutions. Like in one town I read, there was a kind of a department where the resistance fighters helped the deportees in Siberia. So, I'm basically saying that they kind of try to persevere the independence of Lithuanians by doing all this. Well, unfortunately, the resistance fighters were outnumbered, undersupplied, and lacked proper weaponry and ammunition from the very beginning. So it was always a fight that I think, and from what I read, a lot of the resistance fighters felt this way, is that they thought that they're going to lose this fight. However, they refused to live under the Soviet regime, and they choose, well, a lot of them said that they choose to die instead. So in 1946, Moscow started putting considerable effort into suppressing the Lithuanian partisans. At its peak, there were 12 regiments of the Security Interior Forces that were dispatched to catch these partisans. There's some stories of how, well, it's hard to say how much they are true, but there's some stories of how 1,000 Soviet troops would be called in to hunt 2 or 3 partisans. However, in reality, it was mostly about 30 Soviet troops assigned for a single partisan. So in the end, the active resistance ended in 1952, and around 22,000 Lithuanians died. For half a century, the Soviet Union kept this war secret. No one was really allowed to talk about it. A lot of people are still kind of afraid to talk about it this day. For example, I tried talking about this issue, this topic of resistance fighters with my granddad, and I don't know, he didn't tell me much besides that they were bandits, and that the other half of his family was killed by Soviets and the other one by Lithuanian resistance fighters. So it's really hard to talk about this topic even now for many people who lived during those times. So now I'll jump a bit. So basically I'll skip the whole Soviet occupation, and I'll tell you about how these resistance fighters and how these deportees, how they played a crucial role in independence of Lithuania. So, for example, the first public memorial service to commemorate Lithuanians who had been deported or killed happened on 14th of June in 1988. It was on this day in 1941 that the first mass deportations were carried out. And the person who basically during this kind of gathering, this memorial service, a deportee raised the Lithuanian national flag publicly for the first time. So you can see, well, that the honor to raise the Lithuanian flag for the first time was granted to a deportee. Well, and in general, former deportees and political prisoners were among the most active participants in mass gatherings. The first public criticism of the Soviet system also came from the former deportees. Drawing on their experiences of displacement, they created a powerful language for justice, the fulfillment which required independence from the Soviet Union, and the establishment of independent, democratic, and non-communist state. On 12th of June in 1989, the Commission and the Organization of Deportees living in Vilnius publicly announced the crimes of Stalinism and announced them as a genocide. So that you can see that they in fact a lot of them put in a lot of work to create this kind of a national revival movement in Lithuania, and a lot of the people who were behind it were actual deportees who experienced the cruelties of the Soviet system firsthand. Then the political symbolism was accompanied by Soro tourism to the places of deportation. So beginning in summer of 1988, thousands of Lithuanians went to look for the graves of relatives who had been deported to Siberia. Some of their remains were brought back to Lithuania by plane. According to the Lithuanian Union of Political Prisoners and Deportees, since then, the remains of 10,000 deportees have been brought back to Lithuania from Siberia and other places of deportation. So, in short, resistance fighters, deportees, and the memory of them were a key element in Lithuanian national revival movement. Now, I kind of gave you this highly idealistic version of Lithuanian history, how we were poor people abused by Soviets, but these are modern times, and people are reflecting on their history more and more and realize that there's evil people on all sides. So for that, I'll talk about this specific event that happened last year summer. So in the picture on the left, you see Škirpa. He was a highly distinguished Lithuanian government official. He did a lot to Lithuanian independence. However, he promoted anti-Semitism on a governmental level. He collaborated with Nazis in Holocaust. On the right, you have Noreika. He was also a very distinguished resistance fighter who fought against the Soviets. However, there are official documents which reveal that he signed on a kind of a letter to confiscate all the belongings of Jews in this one major Lithuanian city in the 1940s. So you have an issue here. You have people who are objectively did a lot for Lithuanian independence, people who are praised as national heroes for decades, but at the same time you have this information about them that they partook in Holocaust. So last year, in the right picture you can see a memorial plaque, kind of, and it was dedicated. There are memorial plates. There were memorial plates like that dedicated to both Škirpa and Noreika. However, the Vilnius City Council and the mayor of Vilnius decided to. Vilnius is the capital of Lithuania, by the way, and the mayor decided to take these memorials down. I think it was a great decision because to be a national hero, you have to have a clean history. You can't. Someone like them should not be seen as national heroes despite how much they done for Lithuanian independence. And with this, I want to show you that a lot of Lithuanian history is often led by kind of a blind nationalism, and I think that right now we are slowly moving away from that, and we are realizing that we had quite a few bad people on our side as well. But the issue I had with the taking down of the memorials, so basically the whole thing happened at 4 a.m. without discussion with the general public. So what happened here is that the government basically decided to remove part of national memory without discussing with the people. They basically missed out on a great opportunity to discuss what wrongs they did. It could have been used way better if there was a public discussion with historians who, for the most part, support this decision by Vilnius mayor. If they had an open discussion with the population, say them why it's wrong, and then took them down, I think it could have been better. But it's a minor detail, and in general I very much agree with the decision of Vilnius mayor. So for the last slide, I have basically I have these problems. I have these problems with the narrative I was briefly describing to you. How cruel the Soviets were, how noble Lithuanians went out to fight them. Well, the fact is, these kind of narratives, they often ignore others people's histories. For example, in Lithuania, there were 200,000 Jews before the Nazis came, and after they left, there were only 5,000. And there's documents of some Lithuanians collaborating with the Nazis. However, the thing is, this over-focus on our national histories tends to, in a sense, it ignores other people's histories. And for example, the tragedy of the Jews, which I think is just as horrible as the tragedy of Lithuanians, because 200,000 of Jews died in Lithuania, and the community was 400 years old. And yeah, and the same goes for Germans. There were a lot of Germans that were deported or kicked out of Lithuania, Russians and Poles as well. The other issue I have is, well, I told you that Russians are allowed to celebrate the Victory Day. It's not like banned or anything in Lithuania, but in reality a lot of people do not like it, and I think it's wrong, because the way I see it, and from what I talk, they have their own celebration, and this idea in most Lithuanians' mind that the history is when it becomes very personal, it fails to see others people's histories. So I think that's quite a bad thing. And the other thing is, well, lastly, I told you this version of history where we have the 1940s and 1950s, and then I jumped straight to the national independence movements, and I kind of ignored everything in between, like the 40 years. But the truth is, it is also kind of same way in schools, the way it's taught, the way do we see our history. It's kind of the Soviet, the Lithuanian Soviet Union almost didn't happen. We don't learn much about it. So, you know, seeing yourself as the victim in everything is, in the end, quite bad. And I think we should, you know, reflect more on who we are and our national heroes and the way that we see our history. So basically, yeah, that's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions relating to this or any other topics, yeah, you can ask me.
I will probably return to the screen. I don't know. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, do you want to turn your screen on as well, so maybe people have a picture?
Oh wait, okay. Give me a second. I'll put a shirt on because it's already hot in Lithuania. Wait, give me a second. Well, how do you turn on the? Oh yeah. I got it. Wait, there's like sun behind me, so you can't see me.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and very heavy presentation. I think I'm not the only one who learned a lot about the Lithuanian view, the Lithuanian narrative, and Lithuanian history in the 20th century. So the first question that I received so far is that when in the 60s and 70s, the culture of the victorious country was forced on in the USSR. So basically, the narrative of the winners' nation. And incorporating also the Baltic States, in which many people refused this narrative. How was this reflected in the daily life of Lithuanians of that time? Like, how did they perceive the holidays of victory on May the 9th? So tomorrow, basically, which is celebrated massively in Russia, for instance, still, and June 22nd, as when the official war as the official Soviet narrative date. I don't know, this is so weird English. It's the date when the Soviet narrative, the war officially began.
So he's asking about the daily life in 60s and 70s, right?
Yeah, and how people perceive like this forced on Soviet education about the Second World War.
Okay, I see. So I don't know much about it from the books, but I can tell you about what my grandparents told me. And my grandmother is 75 now, so she was basically born after the World War II ended. So the way she saw it, well, she basically grew up in, you know, Soviet Union. She didn't see the independent Lithuania before, so from her eyes, it was quite all right. Like she said that, you know, she was just like a student or a high school student, and she said she would just go outside, celebrate the day, and she didn't think much of it. And I think that was the general feeling among the population, because most of the people, well, the ones who did fight against this were resistance fighters, and most of them were killed, and the other ones were deported, and 60,000 of them died. So in the end, the kind of the generation that grew up in the independent Lithuania was basically, most of them just died, and besides that, no other people had an idea of independent Lithuania. So I don't think there was much opposition in terms of the victory day in most, in general population. So yeah, I don't think that there was much opposition, and from what I know, there was not much of it.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions so far? Let's wait for a few moments. If you then, the second question comes from me, like, when you think about maybe stories that you heard in your family about Lithuanian history in the 20th century, so like, what kind of stories are told about the youth, or because I should probably explain the context of the question. So I heard, for instance, that many remember the 80s very well, or the beginning of the 90s and the independence movement in Lithuania. So is there like stronger focus maybe in family narratives on this?
What do you mean by family narrative?
Like, did your parents, for instance, grandparents, talk more about the end of the 80s, or like the time when the Soviet Union was slowly collapsing, and when people were going to the streets, when the Baltic chain was happening?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that. I see the question. Well, I think that for most part, they talk about the days after independence, how it was free, how they, it was just this new thing, freedom. They didn't know what to do with it, and it was, it was democracy, and it was crazy. Like the 90s in Lithuania. Well, from all the stories, well, in my family at least, they were like the crazy times. Everyone was full of ideas. Everything was doing all sorts of things, and they were allowed to do so. So.
Slowly, because
Oh, my bad. So yeah, the 90s. I think people mostly talked about the 90s, and in my family especially. I didn't hear much about the stories before the 90s, the beginning of independence movements. Maybe because my parents were still quite young, and they remember, at least in terms of stories, if they want to tell more interesting stories, they mostly talk about 90s.
Mhm.
And in general, media and etc. Everyone talks about 90s more, not about the pre-90s. It's still like the memories of the when the independence movement just started. I mean, when Lithuania actually gained independence, they still come back to popular media and popular discussions. So yeah, that's basically it.
The second question would then, as soon there is no other, as long as I can see, the second question from the audience would also come from me. Could you point the finger on like a time when the Holocaust commemoration became more of a topic in the Lithuanian discourse?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Like, I think it is becoming more of a topic now. So, for example, in 2015, when I said that no Lithuanian diplomats went to Moscow to celebrate the Victory Day, instead, our president went to the biggest, to the place where most of the Jews in Lithuania were killed, and paid respects to Lithuanian Jewish history, basically. And I think around that time, I would say 2015, 2014 maybe, there were also, more talks about the questionable history of some partisans and their involvement in the Holocaust. I think that the information itself was available for a longer time, but people did not really want to discuss that. And yeah, so I would say around 2015, 2014, something like that.
Mm-hmm. I received another question. It became now quite common and more mainstream in the Ukrainian discourse to talk also about the role of women in the Second World War, or also in great anti-Soviet movements. And what is the discourse like relating to gender issues in Lithuania now about this?
Same. Actually, I just I thought about reading this book for this presentation. It recently came out, and it was like, I would say, one of the best books depicting the resistance movement in Lithuania, and there was a huge portion of it is dedicated to the role of women in the resistance movement. And in fact, there was like, they had quite a big role in it. For example, women were mostly one of the really important things they did was, for example, they carry the messages around, which was basically the essential thing for the resistance movement to persist and not to be destroyed. Like information sharing in those times were crucial, and women were crucial to that movement as well. I didn't read, as I said, I didn't read the book, but I know that it's mostly focused on women. So I would say, but to be honest, besides this, I don't know. I don't think there's much, or I don't think there's enough information about woman participation in in general history, because it wasn't our history is not focused to resistance fighters. So I would say not very much. It's, I think, same as with Holocaust and issues on the Lithuanians, like the bad things, reflection on the things that Lithuanians did. It's also like parallel, like the Holocaust thing is going parallel to the women's thing. I think these issues are slowly brought up to the public more and more. Maybe it's because people are becoming more mature and less sensitive to talk about these issues, and I think they're really important. So yeah, I think there's some discussion about it, but probably not enough.
The next question would be from me again. So Lithuania entered the European Union in 2004, and could you like explain, for instance, or like see some tendencies how historical discourses might have changed or be influenced by European Union membership in Lithuania? Very tricky question.
No, but I see. But do you mean like specifically historical discourse?
Yeah, like on commemoration practices, or like on debates maybe.
It's a tough question. Well, the thing is, I really don't want to say anything, because I don't think I can say something valuable about it, because it did happen 16 years ago. And I don't keep track of the historical discourse that much that I would know the difference really. But I think, as I said, like the examples of like reflection on Holocaust and inclusion of women history show that the discourse is changing, and I think it is because of partly because of the entering to the European Union. Because, for example, there's some issues that for example, the Holocaust thing, it was actually called out by some, I'm not sure it was European Union institutions, but some of the institutions in Europe, they were actually calling out the resistance fighter participation in Holocaust, and like so people actually started reacting more. So I think in some ways, the work of these like international institutions, it definitely influenced the discourse a bit. Yeah.
We just received another question. This would be, are young Lithuanians interested in history in general? So is there like, this is the first question, and then is there a dialogue with Lithuanian neighbors like Poland and Belarus on history and historical remembrance?
Are young Lithuanians? I would say no, because well, they do know about some facts about, well, everyone knows these facts, how Lithuania used to be the biggest country in Europe in 14th century, or the resistance fighters, and something about the depredations.
Not everyone. Maybe you should elaborate on this, by the way. But
No, but like the very basic stuff, I think it's like it's. What do you mean, like elaborate on?
I would just like saying that there was a Commonwealth of Lithuania and Poland, maybe. Like, because not everyone in Ukraine, for instance, knows.
Oh, right. So yeah, there was this country, Lithuania. It used to be like really big. It was like Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, parts of Russia. So everyone knows these facts as wow, Lithuania used to be big, blah blah blah. But they don't know anything specifically about them. And to be honest, I think in fact, like what most people in Lithuania know in terms of history, this kind of stuff in like 14th century, how when we used to be big. But in my eyes, that's not really important. I'm way more interested in, our modern history, because modern history has nothing to do with medieval history in my eyes. So I think this like fascination with the Lithuania being big 600 years ago is kind of stupid. And but in general, I don't think that people are very interested in this in history. I
Mm.
don't think so. It's very surface level, but beyond that, nope.
Uh,
And
and about dialogue then with the neighbors, like with Poland and Belarus.
yeah. So the thing with Belarus, but it's hard to remember it. Okay, so in terms of history, so Belarus and Lithuania was one country for 500 years. It was in officially it was called Lithuania, but we kind of borrowed a lot of Lithuanian like nobility borrowed their culture. So Lithuania and Belarus historically it's super connected. Right now we're nothing alike and we're completely different two worlds. But so and the thing is right now there's actually in some circles, more like obscure circles, there's like Belarusians are claiming that the whatever the Lithuanian Grand Duchy of Lithuania 600 years ago was theirs, and Lithuanians argue that it was ours. Blah blah blah. But this is obscure, and in general level, there's no dialogue with Belarus at all. It seems like they're not even our neighbors. It's like no I don't know anyone who went to Belarus. I don't know, like there's nothing about them. They're like almost ignored in Lithuania, and it's weird. I mean, you can explain that with political reasons, but I think there should be more dialogue with Belarusians or some historical, some cooperation between us. And in terms of Poland, yeah, we've had our issues with Poland, I think, because during the First World War and World War II, Poland occupied the capital, Vilnius. Well, but they had their own reasons, whatever. Let's not get into that. But now I think like a lot of Lithuanians, have had something about Polish people. But recently, in I would say 10, 20 years, I think that the relations are kind of normalized, and there's quite a lot of historical discussions between Lithuania and Poland, because as another thing, we were one country with Poland as well for more than 200 years. So there's a lot of historical discussions, and for example, recently, uh, Lithuanians found a dead body of this resistance leader who led the Lithuanian Polish resistance against the Russian Empire in 19th century. And basically, there was this big celebration, and the Polish Prime Minister came to Lithuania, and everything seemed kind of nice. So I think we're kind of Lithuania is becoming okay with its history more and more. It's in terms of Poland, they're the bigger country there, so we're becoming more okay. We're dealing with the history that is connected with Poland. So yeah, I think there's dialogue, and I can't confirm, on like a higher level between historians, but I'm sure there is, and I'm quite happy about our view of Poland, that it's changing in positive, actual, ways. Yeah.
There actually quite, I mean, political work also for international organizations happening in Belarus is almost impossible under current circumstances related to the regime that the people living with there. But there are quite a few international programs then based in Vilnius who focus on Belarus from Vilnius on. So there might be also a historical reason why international organizations are actually choosing then to work on Belarus from Vilnius. This was just a thought that I had.
No, I don't know about them. Yeah, that's interesting. I thought we don't have like any, because on like higher political level, there's no connection at all. But I'm glad to hear that at least someone is doing something in terms of Belarus.
A few words also on the contemporary Lithuanian-Ukrainian relationships. I mean, you said also something at the very beginning, but maybe you'd like to add something on.
Yeah, sure. So I think that I don't want. I think that Lithuania is where it is because of idealism of America. Like, we are part of NATO and EU because Americans were idealistic about us, and they saw the democracy in us. And I think when Lithuania entered the EU, I think we continue with the same idealism in some ways. For example, in regards to show support for Ukraine and Crimea. Like, the discussions about Ukraine have never left media and some politicians' minds since Crimea. Basically, I have this guy. I think he's one of my favorite Lithuanian politicians, Andrius Kubilius. He's like he used to be a prime minister of Lithuania. Now he's in the European Parliament, and he constantly talks about Ukraine and issues in Ukraine. For example, just a few hours ago, actually, I read an article of his. He was basically suggesting to celebrate the Victory Day in Kiev because almost as many Ukrainians died fighting Nazism as Russians. Well, of course there were more Russians, but there are a lot of Ukrainians. And he suggested doing this because he sees the Victory Day, in Moscow more as a show off of guns. And if we actually wanted to commemorate the Victory Day for what it actually supposed to represent, well, in my mind, what it actually, in Lithuanian mind, then you wouldn't mind moving it to Kiev and probably attending it as well. So I think that Lithuania is like a trusted ally of Ukraine. And for example, I was reading a bit about Zelensky. I was following him a bit, and when he was elected as the president, the first high-ranking government official, for his first meeting, he met up with the foreign affairs minister of Lithuania. I think that says something. I think even though we're small, we can't help that much. But I think with what we have, I think we do help Ukraine. Honestly, I'd like to maybe work in that field future, like Lithuanian and Ukrainian cooperation, and helping you guys with some things if it's possible. So I think that a lot of Lithuanians see Ukraine as kind of a friendly country. It's not like they don't love Ukraine, but they do. Like, if you ask random Lithuanian what they think about Ukraine, is definitely gonna be something positive, at least from my circles and from what I've seen. So yeah, I think that good relations, and I hope it's gonna continue in the future.
I just received another very relevant question. Ukraine is facing also a lot of migration from people moving to Western countries and other countries. And the question relates, how is life and how is migration and emigration, particularly in Lithuania? So is there do people, concretely the question states does a young person feel comfortable in Lithuania or not? Or are people active in their country's political development, participate in this, or do they seek a better life in other countries, for instance? So what about the question of migration and general satisfaction in Lithuania?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, Lithuania, there are a lot of people left since independence. I think at some point there were 3.7 million Lithuanians in some point in the 90s probably, or early 2000s, and now there's 2.8 million people. So you can imagine how many people actually left Lithuania.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I was studying during my master's studies in London, and there is a district in London which is considered one of the biggest Lithuanian cities because there are Lithuanians who live there.
Yeah, for sure. There's hundreds of thousands of Lithuanians in UK, and considering how many of us are there in the world, it's a huge group of people that left. And in terms of, well, there's few things, I guess, the political activeness of the young people and opportunities. I think there are definitely opportunities for young people here. So the people, I don't wanna blame workers and say, but I think the people who mostly leave, they're for the most part, they usually leave after high school or without a university degree. They just they just go there to make money, and I think that's a valid reason, because the minimum wage in Lithuania is like what, 400, 500 euros, and Netherlands you get 1,500 euros. So if you want to make money, that's sure. But in terms of like, if you do go to university, I think there's quite a lot of opportunities in Lithuania, and I see quite a lot of people studying abroad and coming back to Lithuania and work here. So in the end, I think there are opportunities. There's, as I said, if you want to make money, there's definitely better places. You can just go to Germany. You don't need any visas, no nothing. You just go there and work. But in terms of actual opportunities, yeah, I think there's quite a few in Lithuania. And another thing is, we last year, it was the first year since 2008 when we have a net positive migration, meaning that more people came than they left. So it finally stabilized. I think it's, because a lot of people left because of economical reasons, but now that the living standards for everyone are quite decent, people are not leaving anymore, and there's more opportunities. And regarding the second part of the question, the political activeness, no, I don't think that people are politically active enough. You can see that in like our voting, for example, turnout, like how many people go to vote. We have one of the lowest numbers in Europe, which is, I think, it's quite sad, because some parties that are really sketchy in my eyes, they go to the parliament because these young people who have some sense in them, I talk to my friends and everyone, and they just don't vote. So if they gave their votes, the situation, the political situation, the whole situation, I think in Lithuania would be way, way, way better. So yeah, there's not enough political activeness. There's like artificial kind of way to teach Lithuanians, about politics in school, blah blah blah. But these things never work. They, from what I've seen, from what I experienced in high school, there's this class where they teach you about politics, but it doesn't work. No one takes it seriously. It's not, and I think that partly comes from, there's some Soviet legacy in that general mistrust of government. It's like it's passed down to us from our parents in some way. Like, people do not trust the political system. A lot of them don't. They're just like, oh no, everyone's a thief. Everyone's just it's gonna be bad anyway. So why even try or do anything? So yeah, that's the mindset that a lot of people have, and I think it's really sad for me. Yeah.
I have another question which might interest also, like, interest a few of our viewers. It's like quite a few countries faced a religious revival after the end of communism. Was there like a tendency, for instance, that particularly the Catholic Church, because historically Lithuania was mostly Catholic, got stronger, or is there like, are there any recent trends in this?
No, I don't. I know that like religious things played a big role in the independence movements in Poland. Like it was like, for us, like for Lithuanians, it was kind of the resistance fighters, deportees that gather kind of demobilize the public. In Poland, church played a big role in that. But in Lithuania, no, that was not the case. And I don't know a single. I'll honestly tell you, I don't know a single young person who goes to church or believes in God. Even my parents, who were like, they told me to take the religion classes in the primary school. They tried going to church at some point, but I think they gave up. I don't think there's any religious revival. And those numbers you see online on how Lithuania is one of the most religious countries in Europe, I really don't believe them. Maybe it's sort of a identity thing. People identify themselves with like Christian values, however they imagine them, and it's sort of an identity thing. Like, if you ask my parents, they will tell, yeah, sure, I'm Christian, but the last time they were in church was like 5 years ago. So does that make you a Christian? Well, I wouldn't say so. And I think that's the case in most families. Maybe the rural population is different. I honestly don't know that many people from like rural areas, but they might be more religious. But in terms of big cities, no one's religious.
But the identity issue is very interesting. Like I heard also from some Lithuanian families who were secretly baptizing, for instance, the children as a like symbol of resistance, like of course silent resistance because they're not really telling anyone, but just by showing like this that they are not obeying to the Soviet rule and forced upon on them atheism. And from my side, the last question would be like, how does contemporary like life or intercultural communication between different groups in Lithuania work out? So you mentioned that there is a Jewish community, around 5,000 people are living again, more or less in Lithuania, mostly in Vilnius, as far as I know. There is a quite significant Polish minority, if I recall correctly, and there are, of course, also some Russians still living mainly in Vilnius, because what many people also don't know is that Lithuania has significantly less Russian speakers and people identify as Russia than, for instance, Latvia and Estonia. So how does intercultural life currently look like in Lithuania?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll be honest. I'm from Kaunas. That's the second biggest city in Lithuania. There's no minorities here at all. I would maybe 1-2%. So I'll be mostly talking about what I read and what I hear from other people. So I might be completely wrong with this, but I've read a study somewhere that Russian minority is one of the best treated minorities in European Union out of all the existing minorities. Again, might be nonsense, but that's what I read. I think that the situation, well, it also depends on the where we're talking in Lithuania. It is a small country, but in the capital, I did live there for a few months, a year back. So from my experience, it's quite all right. Like I don't think that even in private, I personally, my friends they don't like make jokes about Russians or Polish people. So even in private, I can tell you honestly that I think it's quite all right. And the interesting thing is basically what happened in the difference between Lithuania and Latvia. So in Latvia, when they became independent, they didn't give Russian minorities citizenship because they had very strict tests and they didn't speak, the language quite well, which is quite understandable in my opinion. And in Lithuania, everyone was granted citizenship, basically everyone. So from the very beginning, the Russians could feel like they're part of the country, and I don't think that they're excluded on the higher level in any way. There might be some intercultural clashes, but I also see like this, for example, my personal experience. This Russian comedian, he was like a young dude who grew up in the Bell Lithuania. He's basically my favorite Lithuanian comedian, and he's way better than anyone else. And so and the fact is he's really popular. So I think that people, and the thing is, because he's Russian, he always brings up the fact that he's Russian to make jokes about like Lithuanians, whatever. And people are okay with it. He's really popular on YouTube for Lithuania scale. So I think that young people don't really care. There's some bad situations in with some, I would say, Polish and Russian minorities are a bit different in Lithuania because Poles have a stronger identity of that they're Polish, and they do vote for their own party, which, well, you don't know how much of that is rumors, but there's information about that party being financed by Kremlin, and the officials in Poland don't really communicate with that party that well. So it's kind of like the Poland itself pushed that party aside. So you can, and there's many other issues I could tell you about regarding that party. So in general, I think Russians, they're integrating quite well. A lot of them feel Lithuanian. Lithuanians don't mind that. It's quite okay. And with some Polish minorities in some regions, it can be bad. Yeah. So basically, a short summary. And there's also some Ukrainians coming in. I know one Ukrainian personally. People don't mind them. They're actually, at least, again, my circles, they're actually quite happy that someone actually wants to come here and live here. So I'm fine with that as well. I mean, if people want to come here, I'm cool. I'm cool with it.
This is actually an interesting topic. Do you know more about like recent migration from Ukraine, particularly to Lithuania?
Yeah. There's some people. There's well, the reason why I told you before that there's more immigrants coming in than moving out is because of Ukrainians. Some of them do actually, you know, come here and enjoy living here, and from my talk, it's quite okay. But most of them do like going to Poland more, from what I heard, because I guess it's a bigger country and the languages are sort of more close, so they do enjoy going there more. But yeah, there's some Ukrainians coming in, and I don't think that people mind it. Well, there's some older people who, you know, dislike immigrants in general, but they're they're just stupid. I that's, you know, to put it nicely. Uh, because yeah, but in general, I think young people my age and in their 30s and around 40s are okay with immigrants, and you know, on the general level, yeah.